The call of the invisible. Imagine leaving everything behind. Everything you know, your home, your culture, your gods, your history, and walking to nowhere. Because someone told you to. Not a king, not a prophet, but a voice. A voice no one else heard. A voice no one else saw. A voice that came from the invisible. This is the beginning of the journey of a man named Abram. An ordinary man living in Ur of the Chaldeans, a thriving metropolis of its time, with streets paved in fired bricks, temples to lunar gods, and a system that promised security and prosperity. Abram had every reason to stay. He had land, he had servants, he had flocks, he had Sarai, his wife. He had a comfortable life. But he also had something no one else had, a calling. One silent night while the world slept, Abram heard for the first time the voice that would change everything. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. There was no map, no clear destination, just a command and a promise. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. The words didn't come with explanations or details, but they came with authority. And Abram, in a way no one could rationally explain, knew he had to obey. The conflict begins here, between comfort and the unknown, between what can be touched and what can only be believed. Sarai watches him with eyes full of a mix of curiosity and fear. "Where are we going?" she asks. Abram answers honestly, "I don't know." That's where the script of faith begins. Because in this world, faith isn't about knowing. It's about going even when you don't. They pack everything: servants, tents, provisions. Lot, Abram's nephew, decides to join them. He's young, impulsive, but loyal to his uncle. The caravan forms, and they leave. The city of Ur fades into the horizon, and the desert becomes their new stage. Days under the scorching sun. Cold nights under starlit skies. No cities in sight. No proof they're on the right path. Just an invisible direction carried by a voice that has now gone silent, but whose presence still pulses with every step. They reach Haran. They stay there for a while. Maybe weeks, maybe months, until the order comes again. Go. And Abram goes. They cross borders. They enter Canaan, a land already occupied. Strange, hostile. But something within Abram whispers this is the beginning. He builds an altar. Not a throne. Not a fortress. An altar. A symbol of surrender. And there, in a land that is not yet his, he calls on the name of the Lord. Not one God among many, but the only one who dared to call him on a journey no one else would understand. Time passes, a famine strikes, and with it the first crisis. They go down to Egypt. Abram stumbles. Afraid for his life, he lies about Sarai, saying she's his sister. Pharaoh takes her into his palace, but before disaster unfolds, God intervenes. Plagues strike the Egyptian court, and the truth comes out. Abram's failure reveals something important. Even the called stumble. Even the obedient falter, but God doesn't abandon those he calls. Even in failure, there is mercy. They leave Egypt, return to the land, to the altar. And Abram begins again. It's here that he and Lot part ways. The land can't support both. Their herders fight. Abram humbly lets Lot choose first. If you go left, I'll go right. Lot chooses the green plains near Sodom. Abram stays in the hills. Lot chooses by sight. Abram chooses by promise, and right after that, God shows up again. This time more clearly. Lift up your eyes. Look north, south, east, and west. All the land you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. The promise expands, and Abram is no longer just a traveler. He's an heir. The journey continues, and faith deepens. Abram rescues Lot from a war. He refuses riches from the king of Sodom. He meets Melchizedek, priest of God Most High, who blesses him with bread and wine, a symbolic moment, a foreshadowing of what will come centuries later. But questions remain. Abram still has no child, still sees no fulfillment. That's when God takes him outside the tent and says, "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be." And Abram believes, and it is credited to him as righteousness. The chapter ends with a sacred covenant, sacrificed animals, a blazing torch passing between the halves, a sign that God binds himself to the promise, even if Abram doubts, even if he stumbles, even if time slows down. This is not just the birth of a nation, but the beginning of a new way to live, a way not built on sight, but on a voice that doesn't go silent, even when everything else does. This is just the beginning of Abram's journey of faith, and the invisible one who called him still has much more to reveal. Promises beneath the stars. The days rolled on, and the heat of the desert sun no longer felt foreign. Abram had grown used to the rhythm of the unknown, setting up tents, taking them down, moving flocks, digging wells, waiting, always waiting. For what? A voice that no longer spoke as often, a promise that hadn't yet come true. He remembered every word. "I will make you a great nation." Yet years had passed and there were no children, no son, no heir, just silence. But silence didn't mean abandonment, and waiting wasn't punishment. It was the crucible of faith. It was in this space between promise and fulfillment that Abram's heart was being forged into something unshakable. By now, Abram's camp had grown. He wasn't just a traveler anymore. He was a tribal chief, a man of wealth and renown. Servants bowed in his presence. His name carried weight among kings, but none of it mattered, because he had no child to inherit it. One night, as the fires of his camp flickered low and the stars shimmered overhead, the voice returned. Not in thunder, not in a storm, but in that quiet, unmistakable tone that had once called him from Ur. "Tidar, not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." Abram, now bold with time and longing, responded, not with reverence, but with raw honesty. "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? The heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." He wasn't bitter, but he was tired. Tired of holding on to something invisible. Then came the response. Clear, firm, unexpected. "This man will not be your heir. A son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." And then the most dramatic moment of the night. "Come outside." Abram stepped into the night, the cool air brushing against his face. Above him, a blanket of stars stretched in every direction, silent witnesses to a promise beyond comprehension. "Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be." Abram's breath caught. Not because he could count them, but because something inside him finally surrendered. He believed. And in that belief, the impossible became possible. Not immediately, but eternally. The text doesn't describe a thunderclap or angels descending, but something shifted. Heaven recorded it. A man had trusted beyond reason. That faith became his righteousness. But God wasn't done. He led Abram deeper. "I am the Lord, who brought you out of Ur to give you this land." And Abram, again, dared to ask, "How can I know that I will gain possession of it?" The answer, not a speech, but a covenant, a ritual older than kingdoms. Abram was instructed to bring animals, goats, rams, birds. He cut them in half, placing the halves opposite each other, forming a blood path. As night fell, a dread, heavy and holy, came over him. Then a vision, a prophecy, of descendants enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years. A glimpse of Egypt, of suffering, of future deliverance, and then fire, a blazing torch, a smoking firepot, symbols of divine presence. They passed between the pieces. Alone. God walked the path. Abram did not, because this promise wasn't dependent on man. It was unconditional. God bound himself to it, alone. On that night, in the middle of nowhere, a new world was born. Not with armies, not with empires, but with stars, and a man who dared to believe. The next morning, life returned to normal. Servants bustled, herds grazed, but everything had changed. Abram now carried the weight of a promise etched not in stone, but in his soul. Still the days were long. Sarai remained barren, and hope, though once ablaze, flickered again. One evening Sarai approached him. Her face was stern, her eyes tired. "Abram, the Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my servant Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her." The silence that followed was thick. Abram said nothing. Perhaps he thought this was the way. Perhaps he feared another decade of waiting. He agreed. Hagar conceived, and everything unraveled. The moment Hagar knew she was pregnant, the power dynamic shifted. She looked down on Sarai. The servant became smug. The mistress became bitter. Sarai blamed Abram. "May the Lord judge between you and me." Abram, unwilling to intervene, told her, "Do with her as you see fit." Sarai mistreated Hagar, harshly, so much so that the young servant fled into the desert. Alone and pregnant, Hagar found herself near a spring, and it was there, far from the tents of the promise, that the angel of the Lord appeared. "Where have you come from? And where are you going?" Hagar poured out her pain, and the angel gave her a strange directive. "Go back, submit to Sarai." And then came a promise, for her too. "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." She gave God a name that day, El Roi, the God who sees me. She returned, and when her son was born, Abram named him Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old. But Ishmael was not the child of the promise. He was a product of human calculation, not divine fulfillment. 13 years passed. 13 long, silent years. Then, when Abram was 99, the voice came again. But this time, it was different. God introduced himself with new power. "I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless." Then came a renewal of the covenant, but with it a sign. No longer would he be called Abram. His name would be Abraham, father of many. And Sarai, her name would become Sarah, princess, for she would bear a son. Abraham fell face down, laughing to himself. Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at 90? He pleaded, "If only Ishmael might live under your blessing." But God was clear. "Your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him. And as for Ishmael, he would be blessed too. 12 rulers, a great nation. But the covenant would pass through Isaac." That day Abraham obeyed. He circumcised every male in his household, a painful, permanent sign of a deeper covenant. The chapter ends not with fulfillment, but with preparation. The stars were still there, the desert still vast. Sarah was still barren. But Abraham now walked with a name that meant father of many, even without a single son from Sarah. Because faith doesn't wait for results to believe, it believes so results can follow. Between waiting and despair, the desert knows how to stretch time. Days burn slowly under the sun. Nights freeze beneath endless stars. And in the silence between both, Abraham waits. 13 years have passed since Ishmael's birth. 13 years without a single word from the God who once lit up the sky with promises. 13 years of watching his son grow, wondering if perhaps this was it. Maybe Ishmael was the fulfillment. Maybe the waiting was over. But deep down he knew God had promised Sarah, and Sarah was still barren. He woke each morning beside a woman whose eyes no longer sparkled with hope. Sarah had aged with the silence. Her laughter faded. Her gaze lingered too long on Ishmael, half in longing, half in loss. Abraham pretended not to notice. But the tent felt heavier each year. Then came the sound again, familiar, final, like thunder inside his bones. I am El Shaddai. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. After years of silence, God didn't offer comfort. He offered a challenge. The time of waiting was ending. The time of fulfillment was near, but it would demand more than belief. It would demand identity, Abraham. That was the new name. Not exalted father, but father of many. And Sarah, too, no longer princess of one household, but mother of nations. God changed who they were before changing what they had. That day, Abraham circumcised every male in his camp. Pain marked the covenant. Obedience became flesh. And still, they waited. Then 3 strangers appeared. Dust on their sandals, eyes that saw too deeply. Abraham rushed to serve them, sensing something divine beneath the dust. He fed them, honored them, stood beside them under the heat of the day. Then came the question, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" He paused. "In the tent," he said. The voice replied, "I will return about this time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Inside the tent, Sarah laughed, not with joy, but with bitterness, with the ache of decades, with the cruelty of hope too long withheld. She laughed because to believe again was dangerous. And yet, the voice called her out. Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Sarah denied it. I did not laugh. But he answered, yes, you did. And with that, the silence was broken. The promise now had a countdown. 12 months. 1 year. Time had returned, but not without chaos. Not long after, Abraham looked down toward the valley, toward Sodom and Gomorrah, cities thick with wealth and wickedness. Lot lived there, his nephew, his burden. And God, in a moment of startling intimacy, said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do?" Abraham was not just a recipient of promises now. He was a partner, a friend. He stood before God and dared to plead. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people? The negotiation began. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. Each time God answered with patience. Each time Abraham pressed deeper, as if fighting for the soul of a world he did not belong to. But in the end, the cities burned. And Lot barely escaped. His wife turned to salt, his daughters scarred by what they saw and what they would later do. Abraham watched the smoke rise from the hills. He said nothing. He only remembered the words. Next year. Time passed. The camp moved again. This time to Gerar, another land, another lie. Fearing for his life, Abraham once more said Sarah was his sister. Abimelech the king took her into his palace. And again, divine intervention. In a dream, God warned Abimelech, "You are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken." The king protested his innocence. God listened and spared him. But the damage was done. Even now, after all this time, Abraham faltered. Even heroes of faith stumble. But God did not revoke the promise. Then it happened. It happened without trumpet, without fire, without angels. Sarah conceived, and the impossible became flesh. She gave birth to a son, and they named him Isaac. Laughter, not the laughter of doubt, but of wonder, of disbelief turned into joy, of barrenness turned into birth. Abraham was 100 years old. Sarah was 90. No one could explain it. No one could deny it. The whole camp rejoiced. But not all joy is clean. Ishmael, now a teenager, watched it unfold. The boy who was once the hope, now stood outside the promise. And Sarah saw the tension, the mocking glances, the rivalry forming. She turned to Abraham and said, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son. That boy will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." Abraham was torn. Ishmael was his blood, his firstborn, his son. But God spoke. "Do not be distressed. Listen to Sarah. It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." The next morning Abraham rose early. He packed water and bread. He gave them to Hagar. And with a heavy heart, he sent them away. In the desert, when the water ran out, Hagar laid her son under a bush and walked away. She couldn't bear to watch him die, but heaven could, and God spoke. "Do not be afraid. I will make him into a great nation." And once again, a well appeared, water in the wilderness. God was faithful, even to those outside the covenant. Back in Abraham's camp, the boy grew. Isaac, the child of laughter, filled their days with new life. He ran, he learned, he asked questions. He became the joy that God had promised, and yet Abraham knew. The journey of faith was never about comfort. It was about surrender. And soon, the ultimate test would come. But for now, between waiting and despair, God had kept his word. The mount of testing. The desert wind no longer stung Abraham's face as it once did. Age had thickened his skin, and faith had deepened his resolve. Isaac now walked beside him, no longer a toddler clinging to his mother, but a young boy, curious, strong, innocent. He was the fulfillment of laughter, the promise in flesh and blood. Abraham watched him laugh with servants, help with the sheep, ask questions about stars and stories. And every time he looked into the boy's eyes, he saw more than his son. He saw prophecy, covenant, and the fingerprints of God. But that made the next command even more unthinkable. It came without warning. No trumpet, no cloud, no angel. Just the voice. The same voice that once told him to leave his father's house now spoke again. Only this time, it asked for everything. "Abraham." He answered, as always, "Here I am." Then the words came. Words that shattered his soul but didn't shake his obedience. "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him. There is a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." There was no hesitation recorded, no argument, no delay. Early the next morning, Abraham rose. He split the wood himself. He saddled his donkey. He took 2 servants. And he took Isaac. For 3 days they traveled. 3 days of silence between a father and his son. 3 days where every step felt heavier than the last. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He turned to the servants and said something that still echoes through history. "Stay here. We will worship and then we will come back to you." We, not I. Abraham still believed. Somehow, Isaac carried the wood. Abraham carried the fire and the knife. And as they walked together, the boy turned and asked, "Father?" Abraham replied, "Yes, my son." The boy's question was innocent, piercing, unforgettable. "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham looked at him and said the only thing his faith could form. God himself will provide the lamb. And they walked on. The mountain was steep. Each step a battle between obedience and heartbreak. When they reached the top, Abraham built the altar, slowly, stone by stone. Then he arranged the wood. And then, with trembling hands, he bound his son. Isaac did not resist. The boy who once asked about the stars now lay on the altar, trusting his father, unaware of the full weight of what was happening. Abraham reached for the knife. He raised it. Time slowed. Heaven watched. And just before the blade could fall, the voice came again, urgent, loud, final. "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he gasped. "Do not lay a hand on the boy, do not do anything to him. Now I know you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham's knees buckled. His hands dropped the knife. And then he looked up, and there, caught in a thicket, was a ram. A substitute, a provision, a foreshadowing. He took the ram and offered it instead of Isaac, and he named that place, "The Lord will provide." Because on the mountain of testing, God had provided the answer. But more than that, he had revealed something deeper. Faith is not just believing in what God gives, but trusting him even when he asks for what he's already given. Obedience is not measured in words, but in surrender. The angel of the Lord spoke again. "Because you have done this and have not withheld your son, I will surely bless you. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed." Abraham and Isaac walked down the mountain together, silent, changed. The boy now knew the weight of sacrifice. The father now knew the cost of trust. And both carried something that could not be seen, faith refined by fire. Back at the camp, Sarah waited. The text is silent about what she knew or felt. But the story had shifted. From here on, Abraham was not just the man of promise. He was the man who passed the test, the man who gave back what was never truly his. In the days that followed, Abraham built no empire. He led no army. But his legacy had become unshakable, because on a mountain called Moriah, he showed that true faith is not in receiving blessings, but in offering them back. Years later, another son would walk up a mountain. With wood on his back, another father would watch. Another sacrifice would be offered. But that time no ram appeared. No voice stopped the knife. Because that sacrifice, on that mountain, was the ultimate fulfillment of Abraham's test. The foreshadow became the reality. The substitute became the Savior. And the faith of one man became the seed of redemption for all. Legacy in the dust. The mountain changed them, but the dust remained the same. The wind still swept the sand across their feet as if nothing had happened. And yet, everything had. Abraham and Isaac returned to Beersheba, silent, bound by a memory that words could not carry. But while one test had ended, the journey of faith marched forward, steadily, quietly, under the weight of age and the question that haunts every man who walks long enough with God. What legacy will I leave behind? Sarah's laughter, once reborn with the cries of Isaac, began to fade. Her steps slowed, her eyes dimmed, and eventually, her breath stopped. At 127 years old, the woman who had laughed at God and then laughed with joy was gone. Abraham mourned, not with wailing, but with a stillness that cracked the soul. He had shared a lifetime with her, wandered lands, feared kings, argued with angels, and watched promises take shape in her womb. And now she lay cold in a foreign land, a land he had no title to, no grave, no place to call his own. Even in grief, the promise was incomplete. So Abraham rose from his mourning and did something bold. He negotiated with the Hittites for a burial plot. Respectfully, yet firmly, he refused to borrow land for Sarah's resting place. "Let me pay the Ibo full price," he said. He bought the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, securing not just a tomb but a statement. This land one day would belong to his descendants, not because he conquered it, but because God had promised it. And this grave, this purchase, was the down payment on that promise. Sarah was buried in Canaan, not Egypt, not Haran, but the land of promise. Her bones became part of the soil that would one day bloom with nations. Time moved forward, slow but steady. Isaac grew into manhood, carrying his own memories of the mountain and the lessons of quiet strength passed from father to son. But the promise could not move forward through memory alone. It needed continuation. It needed a wife for Isaac. And so once again, Abraham sent someone, not himself, but his most trusted servant, on a journey back to his homeland, to find a bride not from the Canaanites but from his own people. The servant set off with camels and gifts, but more importantly, with prayer. "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, make me successful today. He asked for a sign, not for riches or status, but for character. A woman who would not only offer him water, but also water his camels. Kindness, generosity, strength. These were the markers of legacy. At the well in Nahor, he met Rebekah. She fulfilled every word of the prayer, without hesitation, without pretense. The servant watched in silence, knowing the hand of God had moved. Rebekah returned with him. The journey was long, the future unclear. But as they approached the tents in the evening light, Isaac was walking in the field, meditating, perhaps, praying. When he saw Rebekah, and she saw him, something shifted. She veiled herself. He welcomed her. And the tent of Sarah opened again, not in mourning, but in marriage. Isaac loved her, and in her he found comfort after his mother's death. Abraham saw the promise move, slowly, quietly, but steadily. He took another wife, Keturah, and had more children, but he sent them east, giving everything to Isaac, because the promise ran through him. The others were blessed, but Isaac was chosen. And when Abraham felt his days drawing to a close, he breathed his last and was gathered to his people, not with fear, not with regret, but with peace, because he had seen the faithfulness of God, in laughter, in sacrifice, in land, in legacy. They buried him beside Sarah, in the same cave he had bought, husband and wife side by side, not in a city of kings, but in the dust of promise. Isaac remained, quiet, contemplative, not a wanderer like his father, but a cultivator. He stayed in the land, dug wells, faced famine, wrestled with his own faith, but he carried the fire forward, not with spectacle, but with obedience. And that was enough. Because legacy is not about building monuments, it's about passing on faith that endures the silence, the sacrifice, the waiting, and even the dust. The promise beyond sight. The wind still whispered through the oaks of Mamre. The same dust still curled around Isaac's feet as he walked the paths his father once carved into the soil. But Abraham was gone. The man who once stood under the stars and dared to believe the impossible had breathed his last. Buried beside Sarah, his journey on earth had ended. And yet the story was far from over, because faith, true faith, never ends with a tomb. It echoes, it multiplies, it grows, even when the one who believed can no longer see it unfold. Isaac now carried the weight, not just of leadership, but of legacy. He stayed in the land, not because it was easy, but because it was promised. Famine came, fear rose, and, like his father before him, Isaac faced choices that tested not his strength but his trust. When the land grew dry, God spoke, not in thunder but with clarity. Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in this land for a while, and I will be with you and bless you. So Isaac stayed, and God did bless him. His crops multiplied, his herds expanded, and the Philistines grew jealous. They stopped up his father's wells, forced him to move, again and again. But Isaac didn't fight. He dug new wells, gave them names, let the water speak for itself. And finally, at Rehoboth, he found space. Now the Lord has given us room, he said, and we will flourish in the land. He built an altar there, just like Abraham, the same wood, the same fire, the same God. And God appeared again. I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid. I am with you. And in that moment, Isaac understood something his father had lived by. Faith is not passed down by words, it's built into the rhythm of obedience. And now it was his rhythm to keep. But the promise needed more than Isaac. It needed continuation. So Jacob was born. And Esau, twins, opposites. One wild, impulsive, driven by hunger. The other quiet, calculating, carrying the seed of destiny. And just like that, the battle between flesh and promise began again. Esau, with his strength, his bow, his appetite, sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. And Jacob, with his hands and schemes, claimed what was never his by strength, but always his by prophecy. Rebekah knew. She had heard it before their birth. The older will serve the younger. But even so, the deception that followed shattered trust. Isaac, old and nearly blind, prepared to bless Esau. But Jacob, urged by his mother, put on his brother's clothes, covered his arms with goat skins, and stood before his father pretending to be someone else. And Isaac, hesitant, confused, deceived, still blessed him. May nations serve you, may those who curse you be cursed, may God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness. It was done. And when Esau returned, the truth exploded. Isaac trembled violently, not in regret, but in realization. He will be blessed, he said, not because of the trick, but because God's plan had prevailed despite it. Jacob fled. Esau burned with fury. And once again, the promise moved forward not through perfect men, but through providence. That night, alone in the wilderness, Jacob laid his head on a stone, and God gave him a dream, a ladder stretching to heaven, angels ascending and descending, and above it all the voice of God, I am the Lord. I will give you this land. I will not leave you. Jacob awoke and whispered, Surely the Lord is in this place. He named it Bethel, House of God. Because faith was no longer a family story, it was his. And through Jacob came 12 sons, a family, a nation, a people who would wrestle with God, walk through slavery, cross deserts, and carry the covenant forward. One of those sons, Judah, would carry the line of kings, and from him, generation after generation, the promise would move silently beneath centuries of exile, rebellion, and return. Until one night, under Roman rule, in a forgotten town, the line reached its climax. A child was born, not in a palace but in a stable, not surrounded by royalty, but by shepherds. Jesus, son of Mary, adopted by Joseph, descendant of David, seed of Abraham. The stars Abraham once counted now seemed insignificant next to the light that shone from heaven that night, because the child was the fulfillment of everything the old man had once dared to believe. He was the lamb God promised to provide, the blessing to all nations, the sacrifice that would not be spared. And on another mountain, outside Jerusalem, on a hill called Golgotha, the story Abraham once acted out with Isaac became real. There was no ram in the thicket, no voice to stop the nails, because this time the Father gave his only Son, and the Son gave himself, so that the promise would be fulfilled, so that through faith, not blood, not law, people from every nation, every tribe, could be called children of Abraham, not because they shared his DNA, but because they shared his trust, because they, like him, believed God, and it was counted to them as righteousness. Abraham never saw it. He died in a tent. He was buried in a cave, but his faith built a future, and that is the legacy of belief. It doesn't always bloom in your lifetime. It doesn't always look like what you expected, but it echoes. It expands, and it outlives you. That's the journey of Abraham. Not the journey of a hero, but of a man who stumbled, doubted, obeyed, surrendered, waited, and still believed that somewhere beyond what he could see, God would keep his word. And he did.